Sir Simon Schama, CBE, which means Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, a type of British honor awarded every year by the Queen, is a university professor of art history and history at Columbia University and a contributing editor of the Financial Times. He is the author of 19 books and the writer-presenter of 50 documentaries on art, history, and literature for BBC Two. He is also the author of The Story of the Jews, Finding the Words, and the second volume, Belonging. Simon's awards are too numerous to list them all here, but include the National Magazine Award for Criticism, an Emmy for his film on Bernini from The Power of Art, as well as Broadcast Critic Guild Awards. He has also won the NCR Book Award for Nonfiction, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the W.H. Smith Literary Award. In 2015, Simon received the Feltrinelli Prize in Historical Sciences. His most recent book, Wordy, Sounding Off on High Art, Low Appetite, and the Power of Memory, was published last year, and his latest television series, The Romantics and Us, began airing on the BBC this month. Joining Simon today is Moment special contributor Robert Siegel. For 30 years, Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine, All Things Considered. In 2018, Robert was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont, Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Please welcome Sir Simon Schama and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you very much. And Simon, it's wonderful to see you.
You too, Robert. It's been too long. We last saw each other at quite a moment, as you might say.
Yes, we last saw each other the day after your other countrymen, after British voters chose to exit the European Union. Yes. And you were kind enough to share your reaction to that vote with me on All Things.
Yes, even though I was mightily hungover, as you might expect, as was a large part of the country.
I think a significant part of the UK was hungover. Well, much has happened since then. We would have thought that Brexit would have been the most dramatic, newsworthy thing happening right now, but for what else has happened. We're about half a year into a pandemic that has changed the way we deal with our friends and colleagues, the way parents and children deal with each other and see one another, the way teachers and students deal with one another. I'm just curious whether you think, as a historian, that what we're going through is a difficult, perhaps in some ways painful interruption, after which, maybe in another year, we go back to pretty much the way things have always been. Or do you sense that this is some time of great change, that there are real changes in our lives and our thinking in the offing because of this terrible pandemic we're experiencing?
My instinct, Robert, is the latter, actually. Although one, mustn't be too complacent and generalize about it. There have been moments where there have been shocking and devastating epidemics, if not a pandemic, in the case of the 1918 Spanish flu, after which not a huge amount did actually change. Although, it's possible, really, that what happened was a kind of almost who was it? I can't remember. It was Alan Greenspan talked about irrational euphoria.
Irrational exuberance.
Exactly, which ultimately led to the catastrophe of the slump. But in the immediate aftermath of 1918, I don't think sort of a lot changed. It's often said even, that moment and the war changed art and music, but those changes have been on course beforehand. But in this case, if you just think about, there are specific things. It's quite clear that the nature of work, the commute to the office, what an office is, that absolutely does seem to be irreversibly altered willy-nilly, even if it was involuntary, that we all do much more at home, and there are probably pros and cons to that. So I think at least there'll be a rethink about, from the commercial point of view, about how all the money that's spent on commercial rent, all the building of commercial property and so on, what can and what cannot be done in a different kind of way. But in a larger sense, will it affect, what we're gripped by now, the nature of politics and the sort of social contract between those who are in power and those who are not? Really, really difficult to say. You think really that it must do, in the sense in which actually those in power, their first duty, whether constitutionally formal or not, is to do everything they possibly can to safeguard the health and safety of of those under whose government, those who are living under their government. Nonetheless, when I saw, do you know this phrase? I saw a phrase last week which was called vaccine nationalism. And, I was sort of horrified by that. In a way, it's all about actually who gets first grab when vaccines finally available. An issue about whether or not actually there's some kind of paramount, relatively altruistic approach really to ensuring the distribution of whatever vaccine becomes available and is safe all over the world, or whether it's sort of first dibs, struck me that, something very visceral and very meaty and very tough, namely the sort of sense of national priorities first, may pay no attention really to the opposite, which is the notion that we're all in the lifeboat together.
That there'll be some tension between a vaccine egalitarianism,
yes,
and simply having a free market of vaccine out there.
I mean, it was an amazing moment in Britain since you queued up the forlorn commie tragedy of Brexit, that very early on in the pandemic, actually, it turned out that the government, and this could have been simply an oversight because it is, and the oversights have been just sort of in cascade. The government had decided not to cooperate in the EU system of early pandemic warning. That was just extraordinary that the EU was offering this to Britain because Britain was in the transition moment, but pretty much offering it, as I understand it, without coattails at all. That we're all in this together. It's the English Channel, despite what you might imagine to be an impenetrable barrier, the White Cliffs of Dover. The pandemic really does not respect the White Cliffs of Dover, and the government nonetheless said, "We're passing on this. We're not part of your organization at all." And that struck me as an absolutely breathtaking moment in which the kind of short-term politics can override some sense of the immensity of this crisis that we're facing worldwide.
Suzanne mentioned the BBC series that we can't see yet, but I assume we will eventually be able to, about the Romantics. You've been immersed in Romanticism for the past a couple of years, I assume, and how the roots of so many of the ways we think of ourselves politically, in terms of nationality, psychologically, have their roots in the work of artists who lived in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And you wrote recently this, which I'd like you to elaborate on. You wrote the street wars of the American election, it's referring to some of the rowdier protests that we've seen, I assume, are just the latest example of the enduring force of what Romanticism inaugurated. You see in those crowds in the streets, you see the hand of the poet William Blake somewhere having responsibility.
Well, I certainly think the hand of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, actually. In the first program, there's a beautiful reading of The Mask of Anarchy, which Shelley wrote at a safe distance in Italy, in the aftermath of the so-called Peterloo massacre, where a mounted militia had rode down a peaceful assembly of people who wanted parliamentary reform. And Shelley wrote really in a state of, as he described it, a kind of boiling rage. But he wrote essentially about what civil disobedience could. He said, let them, if they draw their sabers, let them come at you. He described the moral force of peaceful resistance as unvanquishable in the long run. And on the one hand, one thinks, well, it's all very well for a kind of airy-fairy poet to imagine that. The same poet who had the kind of chutzpah, if he could have spoken Yiddish, to call poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. But, then what we did was cut in, as you know, to that moment, Mandela and Gandhi and Black Lives Matter for that matter. So it seems to me that what the Romantics did, as I sort of say at the beginning of the film, is take a very ancient tradition, that of pilgrimage processions, sort of intercessionary moments where often it wasn't in a state of enraged riot. Often the idea was to win the king round to your point of view if you were starving, as in the 14th century peasants' revolt in Britain. And that sort of sense actually that the crowd could constitute a kind of devotional community. And when you're in it, I don't know how many street demonstrations have you been in my friend? Lots.
Been in?
Yes.
Oh my God. Well, as a participant, it's been a very, very long time.
I know, but you were there nonetheless, right?
I was there, yes.
Exactly. As was I. So, you know.
In fact, my career, I should just say, as a journalist, really began at the major demonstrations at the university that you now serve. So,
oh, that's right. You were
in the
my
1968 Columbia protest. Yeah.
You were a Luddite rather than a Luddite.
Right.
Goodness.
No, I was on the air. I was at the radio station, but yes.
You were. Okay. And were you pouring waters of calm on the kind of boiling magma?
Being very straight, we were, but doing better than lots of grown-ups who were practicing the dark arts of journalism there. So.
Well, I grew up in, we're probably around the same generation. I think I'm a bit older than you, but I grew up during the years of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and at that time, I have to say to our Jewish listeners, you know, I was a fierce member of a Zionist youth movement of the left, of the kind of wet left, as we say, Britain Habonim, and which was vaguely associated with the once grand Labour Party in Israel. And Habonim was very involved in what's now called, in this horrible word, intersectionality. So we were up for marches against the independent nuclear deterrent, and there I was. So you do as you have this kind of brotherhood and sisterhood, you become more than the sum of your parts. And that's what I think the Romantics converted those older devotional religious ceremonies and processions into a sense somehow that the people en masse could actually bring about a kind of moral change of conscience. And of course, you know, one thinks of all the blood and fury and guts of the French Revolution when that happened, but there were moments when, you know, that actually worked. I mean, there was a moment, for example, not in 1789, but in 1774, in the first year, 1775, excuse me, but it was still the first year of the 20-year-old Louis XVI's reign. So he's a very young king with a teenage wife, Marie Antoinette. And there are these incendiary riots because the price of wheat and the price of flour had absolutely gone through the ceiling. And it was a popular belief, really, that price controls were called the just price because the king had imposed a cap on the price of bread. Mm-hmm. And months before, Louis XVI, who was very much kind of rookie in the part, didn't quite know how to be king, had listened to a free market minister called Turgot, and market supply and demand had sent the prices through the roof. So an enormous demonstration invaded Versailles, invaded the courtyard of the palace. The king came on the balcony. They shouted their slogans of grief and rage and pleaded with him to restore the price, which he does. His instinct is to do just that. So this is, you know, we're in the time when people are reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau and they're believing somehow you can exercise moral force. Now, whether or not that happens actually at the end of the 18th century, it's based on a romantic principle that sort of soul can speak to soul, that power and fashion and wheeling and dealing and the normal kind of pragmatic gangsterism of politics can be overridden by an appeal to conscience. And in the 19th century, something happens which is really nothing to do with whether or not romantic conscience can actually prevail. Governments all throughout Europe decide it's a good thing to move government away from palaces like Versailles into the centers of enormous metropolitan cities. Mm-hmm. Thereby, if you have 500,000 people, as was the case in 1848, even in London with the Chartists, basically, and is the case now in Minsk, we're seeing this, aren't we, every weekend in Belarus, you can gum up the works. Mm-hmm. And you then put the incumbent government in the position of saying, you know, mea culpa, I'll do my bit, even if the even if they've got their fingers crossed behind their back, or out with the troops, as in Tiananmen Square, and gun the people down. You know, do you shed blood, or do you actually play for time, or do you actually concede these things? So the Romantics kind of surf the optimism, which you know would seem to us naive, were it not for what we see in Hong Kong, and what we see in Minsk, and what we see when miraculously we see Navalny recovering from a poison plot, and you know, being prepared to do what he did all over again. And that does begin, I think, absolutely with the Romantics' investment in the possibility of popular street politics.
Having heard and read you on British history and European history, and also read the 2 volumes of the Story of the Jews, I can't help but imagining some intersectionality, if you will. That is, if there had been an extra episode about the Romantics, about Jews and Romanticism, would the Hasidim have been our Romantics, our enemies of rationality, and would Zionism ultimately be the fruit of a Romantic ideal? Is it, or are we out of it?
The way I talked about the Besht, you know, the irony is we know actually very little about what he might actually have said. It's all a matter of actually report, as it was with Jesus. It's all an apostolic kind of literature.
I should just say, we're talking about the Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, known for short as the Besht. Yes.
Indeed. And so the sense actually of a saintly figure has a kind of mystical communion which delivers something which the kind of institutional establishment of Orthodoxy can't, is really part of, it's absolutely part of the kind of passion. You know, for example, I think if William Blake had met the Baal Shem Tov, they both would have loved each other. They both would have absolutely instantly have understood what each other were about and what they could deliver, and what the kind of transfiguration of earthly mankind was supposed to be. There were other movements, of course. Methodism, in some sense, even the Great Awakening, was in some sense a sort of spiritual side of what would become Romanticism. Right. The sense that you listen to your heart, and there are ways which are not prescribed by what we now would call science and technology, not what I call, and what Blake called, the kind of tyranny of measurement, that are not simply, you don't live your life always through exercises in calculation, whether economic calculation or political calculation. There is something else that is graspable from the beyond. So that's for better or worse, that's definitely a romantic impulse. Yeah.
I want to go back to that.
I'm sorry. I would say the one figure, since you put me on the spot, who I think in volume 2, and if anybody out there, you probably all Moment readers, there are some of you who may not be, you all know this, but the memoirs of Salomon Maimon are extraordinary. He's a kind of fallen, he never quite becomes a Chassid. He's a fallen Orthodox Jew, and he is constantly full of terrible self-torture, really, and that's a very familiar romantic journey.
I want to go back to what we were talking about when we last sat face-to-face in London. At that time, one of the slogans of the successful Leave campaign, Leave the European Union, Brexit, was "Let's take back control." I remember seeing that phrase. A few months later, let's take it back from Brussels, in other words, from these Europeans. A few months later, Donald Trump was elected president on the promise of making America great again. And in both of those ideas is this fascinating concept that you explore of nostalgia, right. That the way it used to be before they got us involved in all these treaties and all these bureaucrats, the way it used to be, this was a great place. Now it's we've lost it, and we're about to be subsumed into some bland internationalism that we won't express. A core idea, and as you say, it has very interesting roots. As someone once put it to me, it was a draft deferment in Switzerland or whatever. But it's about homesickness. It's about homesickness.
It is absolutely about homesickness. The word was coined as a clinical condition by a doctor in Basel called Johannes Hofer. And he had noticed, really, or there had been reports brought to him, that Swiss mercenaries in the employment of the Pope or the King of France had been dropping like flies, actually been unable to fulfill their normal duties, which were, I think, mostly sort of, standing there overdressed, really, waving already obsolete weapons. But they couldn't manage to do this. And when asked why, they were pining for the Alpine villages. And it was said, and the music and the Alpine horns and so on. And he said homesickness was not simply, bone spurs were not part of it at all, really. It was not a malingering. It was a serious and chronic kind of paralyzing depression, and it affected everything. It affected the way you breathe, your respiratory system, your muscular regimen. It certainly was no hope at all. Amusingly, in a kind of black style, or maybe not amusingly, this was also said to affect Russian troops who were serving in Central Europe in campaigns against the Austrians. And the general, when it was said to him that, well, our troops are, again, dropping like flies because they pine for kasha and borscht and vodka, of course, actually. The Russian general said, well, if they're interested in Russian earth, we'll bring some and we'll bury them alive and see if that cures them.
My gosh.
It did the trick very quickly. But it did presuppose that, there was a homeland, really, that there was a landscape. And what came with the landscape were memories of your childhood. Remember, nationalism comes from natio. It's cognate with native. It presupposes, literally, that you have this kind of strongly emotive identity, which you really suck with your mother's milk, that it is actually part of what made you grow up. And then when you couple that with the cult of the innocence and strength of childhood memory, which the Romantics were very big on, it becomes extremely powerful. So it's a kind of, it's pre-Freudian in a way. It's not wanting to go back to the womb. It is wanting to go back to that kind of imagined idyll of your early life. Music is a very important part of it. Folklore and fairy tales are an important part of it. And then when you kind of ramp it up, when you big it up into a political ideology, it is, the place from which Germany or America or Scotland or wherever has fallen, that's been corrupted by. It almost always has a very, very strong rural and small town tinge to it. If this sounds familiar.
But one of those three things isn't like the others, Simon. That is as you describe it, the Scotland that rediscovered its Scottishness thanks to Robert Burns and his poetry, and the Germans who rediscovered their Germanness through the Brothers Grimm collecting all of these folk tales of German people. Both had been defeated. That is, Scotland, as you write, had finally succumbed and signed the Act of Union, which to many Scots was the end of. It was the end of independence, and would it be the end of being a Scotsman? The German states were defeated by Napoleon, by Bonaparte, and under French dominion. The nostalgia that kicked in the United States 3 years ago didn't. I mean, we did have a bad recession, but we're not occupied by a foreign power. We haven't. Perhaps some people may think that
Robert,
government.
Who was the South's favorite novelist, both before and after the Civil War? It's actually immeasurable. He was the greatest bestseller, and he's not American. Walter Scott is the answer.
Walter Scott, the chivalrous romantic.
Precisely. So, of course, the one, the romance of defeat, because you have a sense of whether it's Germany after the First World War, you have a sense of being stabbed in the back, you have a sense of loss, you have a sense of a wound that you really want to keep open, is the story of the battles around the Confederate flag right now, the battles around Confederate monuments. It's extraordinary. It's too much, I think, to say that, eventually the South has won that Civil War. Absolutely not. But the sort of sense in which, the lost cause, as it was called by one of those who wrote about the South in I think it was the 1870s, it's absolutely astonishing that that's actually never gone away, notwithstanding the fact that Reconstruction was utterly demolished in the years after 1876, and, the Jim Crow hegemony, really, of the Southern white classes was undisturbed until the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s. Notwithstanding all that, there was this extraordinary sense, really, that the way things were had been sort of invaded by the monopoly of power and the monopoly of culture on the part of the great eastern and western cities. And it's just amazing that that's still with us.
Yes, I take your point that the South, which has been voting its own way for many decades, was a defeated part of the United States, but it doesn't explain the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania to me. It doesn't. The sense that rural Ohio, as depressed as it is economically, had the nostalgia would have been all in a much shorter time frame than the things you're talking about. It would have been for the 1950s, when.
Well, I think there were two things again slightly earlier, and maybe this isn't persuasive either, but you'll remember it well, as I will from a distance. There was a sense that the Vietnam War was really a defeat, even though it was a standoff. That there was a sort of a shocking, much more so than the aftermath of the Korean War, I think. There was a sort of shocking sense of the disconnection, really, between heroically victorious America in the Second World War and somehow being unable to project that same moral and military power in Vietnam. And that was sort of, and the explanation for that, again, I don't want to make the comparison to grotesquely reductionist, but it has a kind of feeling of the kind of anguish which fell over Germany, which seemed to be on the brink of victory in 1918, and then suddenly the opposite happened. So the answer to that had to be a stab in the back, had to be kind of betrayal from within. And there are plenty of people who are up for an explanation of the Vietnam War, that the protest movement, people in the great cities, students, pinkos, commies, whatever, tied the hands. Well, they brought down a presidency, and the presidency of LBJ, they tied the hands of the generals. So it was a victory that could have been won that wasn't won. The second thing is something much more commonplace in journalism. Doesn't necessarily make it wrong. A sort of deep sense, you think about the Rust Belt, a deep sense in which globalization, or the kind of concentration of economic power in great corporations, or even in mega entities like Amazon and Google and so on, were kind of impersonal entities that were absolutely the opposite of a production line where you had dignity and respect and a good wage for something you could see, something tactile that was on the production line, whether you were building an automobile or a tractor, or textiles or whatever it was going to be. And that, that was the feeling of that was a kind of profound sense of defeat. So when Stephen Miller, whoever it was, kind of produced Donald Trump's platform, they knew what they were doing when they said, we are with the forgotten man, we are with you, we're with coal miners. Coal miners, didn't want to accept the inevitable, that their industry was not going to be an industry that was going to be viable for very much longer. So again, the sense of a loss of control, actually, of being able to expect your kids, especially kids without college degrees, to have a decent job in industries which once have been famous in America.
Yes, I certainly agree with that, and certainly in terms of the economic arguments and what's happened in recent years certainly in the industrial upper Midwest, and frankly, I don't know how you feel about it. It makes me a little bit wary when I hear too much importance assigned to Russian meddling or various dirty tricks. It's almost to avoid our own policies that had so effectively put business together with cheap labor, whether it was.
Well, you're noticing Joe Biden, you know, whatever his part was in prehistory, as it were, in whether he agreed or disagreed with NAFTA, he's certainly not, you know, one area where he's not differentiating himself very much from Donald Trump is in a certain degree of American protectionism. He's promising to bring yet more jobs back home, really.
Yes.
So, and that's a kind of, whether we agree with it or not, whether it's realistic or unrealistic, it's politically smart, I think. Actually.
Well, it's what the Democratic Party and the AFL-CIO used to stand for, and Bill Clinton and Al Gore very much pivoted into a consensus position on trade, which some people said it didn't do as much damage nor as much good as anybody said of NAFTA, but it certainly isn't a plus to run on nowadays, is it? It's, wouldn't think of it. Is every American presidential election now the most important election that has ever happened in the history of our country?
Yes. I'm trying to think of the last really boring and inconsequential American election. I don't remember there was one. I mean, not in my lifetime anyway, actually.
Do you I mean, what do you make of this campaign? What do you make of the election so far?
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, this one surely is, because I think it seems to be, you know, if I look at my other homeland, Britain, and other countries as well that I'm very fond of and know very well. Let's take a small one, the Netherlands, which I love and have spent a lot of time in. You know, Netherlands was going through, and may still be going through, but I think it's not quite so powerful, a populist moment. If you look at Poland, it's going through an unmistakable populist moment, but they're not populist moments without challenge. The extreme right-wing populist nationalist party in Netherlands did disappointingly in the last election. And of course, you know, the Kaczynski, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, very nearly lost the election, but they won sort of conclusively, but not by the kind of immense majorities I think they were looking forward to. On the other hand, Orban never seems to, he seems to go from strength to strength. So what I'm saying is that I think actually the issue of actually what is the real muscular strength of a very strident, exclusionary populist nationalism are looking to the American election as a litmus test of, you know, whether or not Viktor Orban very confidently said basically liberal democracy is a thing of the past, that the coming thing is illiberal democracy, kind of Bannonite democracy, where if you deliver the washing machines, you don't really, most people do not care that much about the freedom of the press. They're not so puritanical about the independence of the judiciary. Those two things, or, you know, the balance of checks and balances of power between a legislature and an executive. You know, one would hate that to be true, and we will find out in 50 whatever it is days time how much people really care about defending the Constitution, especially since Donald Trump today, did you notice, said that he was, you know, it wasn't at all clear he would accept the result of the election should he lose. So the world is actually looking to see whether or not, you know, there is staying power in these basic fundamental principles of democratic viability, which up until now would never have been challenged.
No, you've reminded me first of something that was told me by a West German parliamentarian, a member of the Social Democratic Party, way back when, shortly after the wall had come down. And a big part of my reporting life was the end of the Cold War, was the sort of the last years of the Cold War, and he said something very interesting. He said, the politics of Eastern Europe have been frozen. They've been in the freezer for decades. So now it will melt, you know, and it's going to smell. It's going to. There are ideas that we haven't heard in Western Europe for 40 years.
When was that said? That's amazingly impressive.
It was
amazingly impressive.
Probably around 92 or 93, something like that.
We were all thinking Lech Wałęsa, you know, followed by liberal intelligentsia. We were living the Václav Havel dream.
Yes.
And they're all going to be high-minded romantics, really, like Havel, going from writing plays to this humanitarian, morally magnificent executive, but he was right.
He was right. He warned me, you know, there are political ideas that haven't been uttered in Western Europe for decades that we're now going to hear.
I remember, Robert, you know, when and it was on your program, it was on your program. I remember exactly when I had a sort of queasy turn, thinking, and it was at the end of June 1989, and I was driving back from my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to pick up my small children and take them home to Lexington. And your friend and wonderful correspondent Sylvia Poggioli came on, and she was talking about someone I'd never heard of called Slobodan Milosevic. And he'd been giving a speech somewhere I'd never heard of called Kosovo at the Field of Blackbirds. And the speech, the occasion of the speech was the 600th anniversary of, hello, Romance of Defeat, of the defeat of the Serbs in 1389. And it was a ferocious, I mean, actually it was less ferocious than he'd been, but it was explicitly a call to arms. Never forget the manifest destiny of the Serbian people. Serbs constituted, you'll remember, 10% of the population of Kosovo. This was in 89, so a full decade before it came to absolute, but it was a sort of curtain up, and I thought, this is sinister and brilliant. Someone has figured out how to climb from under the debris of derelict communist nomenclatura, and by beating a drum that we haven't heard for a long time. You know, that was the same. The only thing that had gone wrong, very badly wrong, was in China. But otherwise, Wałęsa's party was in power. There'd actually been a democratic election of sorts in Russia. The skies were sunny and fair. And I thought, who is this man? He's very clever, and this is extremely ominous.
Yes,
and as your friend described, I think.
Yes, yes, and Sylvia. I remember Sylvia once circulating when she came into Washington, a short story by a famous Serb writer who's it's
Daniel Kish.
Bridge Over the Drina, yes, and it was a story about life in Sarajevo, and she wanted to put the lie as she saw it to the image of Sarajevo as having been an idyllic, multi-confessional city where Serbs and Muslims and Croats and Jews all lived together in perfect harmony, although there were Ashkenaz Jews and Sephardic Jews who kept their distance from each other. But you know that Serbia that Sarajevo had always been a very wonderful, peaceful place, and it was all about the sort of the hateful conversations inside the closed doors of the households, the real animosities that survived for centuries, even as public life was achieved some decorum and civility. And I think Sylvia was, I think she was fed up with hearing about how wonderful a life had been in Yugoslavia before it broke up. And I thought it was one of those extremely pessimistic, let's say, it was a jaded view of life, but in ways borne out by what happened subsequently. It didn't describe everybody, but it certainly wasn't
I went to Kosovo last. I'm interested in writing a little bit about this in due course. Went to Kosovo this time last year and talked to a lot of people who've been through that whole time. And one thing was just extraordinary. It sounds eccentric and bizarre. You know, when you first hear about it, but you know, one of the first moments of real Serbian fist-clenching fury about what they saw to be the presumption of the Albanian Kosovars was when a deputation was sent to the central legislature in Belgrade. So this would have been about 1986 or something like that, to change the national anthem. which was "Hoi Serbians" or something like that. It was assumed that Yugoslavia, or particularly Serbia, which included Kosovo as a province, but not as an independent republic, was simply only about Serbians. And they weren't particularly militant about it. It was a kind of petition signed by members of the elected council in Pristina, and all hell broke loose over the sheer outrageous temerity that not only have they overpopulated our Kosovo, but now they actually are proposing to change the whole national anthem to de-Serbianize it. And one of the things you'll know I sort of say is that things like music actually can take on a disproportionately powerful force of polarization, and so it's been. These things, I think, actually, we're all living in. I think another reason why nationalism has had a second coming is that we're all living our device lives. We're all living in a kind of cybersphere where the high streets rule. So that it's this kind of sense, actually, of that we're in this kind of grey soup of sameness in some way that makes the sort of anchorage in what the Romantics discovered about particularity and not apologizing for difference so psychologically appealing.
Well, Simon, I could go on for another hour with you, but I think some of our attendants there. Well, there's Suzanne Borden, remarkably, right on cue, who has the questions that people have been suggesting. So, Suzanne, I hand off to you.
Yes, thank you both. And again, if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm sorry that we won't be able to get to all of them. Simon, being a historian and your belief in the importance of history, how do you feel about all of the statues that are now being taken down?
Well, it depends who we're talking about, really. It's been happening in Britain too. And for example, there was a statue of a slave trader called Edward Colston in the center of the city of Bristol, which was taken down, which was really pulled down. On the one hand, I was not going to grieve to see him disappear from his plinth, but it's too good an opportunity to simply be the result of kind of crowd action, of crowd impulse. Statues, and the whole sense of what a monument represents. And usually these monuments were built, particularly we're talking about statues of Southern generals, for example, Stonewall Jackson and the like, Robert E. Lee. They were generally put up in the very last years of the 19th century. Again, as part of what Robert and I were talking about, the romance of defeat. They should be an opportunity for historical discussion, for debate, for education, rather than simply, I remember, I'll tell you, questioner and Suzanne, one amazing thing, when I was filming a long time ago now, The History of Britain, and we did a big number on India, we were doing a sequence in Delhi talking about the so-called Durbar, this great kind of festival which pretended to enthrone Queen Victoria by proxy as the Empress of India. And there'd been, just a kind of multiplication of pompous statues of British viceroys and monarchs and members of the aristocracy. Have you seen this, Robert? And they were all actually, they weren't removed, but they didn't really go anywhere. They were actually in a sort of weed infested car park at the back of this enormous, being really shat on by feral dogs, gloomily standing there. And I thought, well, I didn't really care about that, but what a lost opportunity to talk about the pros and cons, mostly cons of the British Empire. I will just add the point which I made. I also wrote a long and rather sententious piece in my newspaper, the Financial Times, about that. I mean, monuments shouldn't be confused with history. The story of monuments is the story of the people and the impulse, which can be noble as well as ignoble. The story of those who decide at a particular point of time to turn memory into a figure. How do we all feel, Robert? How do you feel about the Eisenhower Memorial? Have you seen it? Have you been there? Yeah.
No, I haven't been to the Eisenhower Memorial.
Yeah.
You mean not the World War II Memorial, the
No, there's an Eisenhower. It's just open. It's just been
Oh, no, 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 it hasn't.
open. Yes, yes.
Um,
It is. It strikes me as not as inspiring as it might have been.
yeah, well, I find the Second World War monument not as inspiring. I mean, the worst thing said of it was that it might have been what the other side would have built had they won. The aesthetic of the World War II memorial is lost on me, but I haven't seen the Eisenhower yet. No.
Okay, thank you. Someone would like to know, how does a politically liberal Jew deal with the anti-Semitic character of intersectionality?
Unhappy about it. You mean that's a very compressed question, meaning how does, well, the point at which pro-Palestinian sentiment, much of which I share, turns into vicious anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism mutates into outright anti-Semitism. A politically liberal Jew like me should react with amplified outrage. Actually, there was somebody on the Twitter sphere tweeted. Did you see this? You will tweet it. You will see it, I'm sure. There was a small but loathsome demonstration, I suppose, timed for the signing of the arrangement, as we should probably call it, between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE today. But it was a kind of free Palestine parade. But one of the chants of that parade was Hitler, Bibi, just the same, all that's different is the name. That's the point where outrage is appropriate and horror is appropriate, really. In Britain, we obviously had this, I was quite involved in that. We had this terrible ongoing business with the Labour Party, or particularly Jeremy Corbyn's inability or unwillingness to deal with it, which was a horrible and morally disgusting thing, really. And one of the first things, good for him, that Keir Starmer did was actually to deal in a very forthright way. But the general question is really, I don't know if it comes from somebody in an academic community. The first time I was actually aware of really how Jewish students in colleges were feeling very upset, and rightly so, and defensive, and being called dirty Zios, and feeling unable to really declare that they were Zionists. In order to be a Zionist, you don't have to be a follower like me. You don't have to be a follower of Bibi Netanyahu or anyone further to the right. You can simply have a belief in Jewish self-determination in the place where our identity was founded. But what was happening, of course, was, and which has happened to a rabid degree and is getting worse and worse and worse. The internet doesn't help. More people are reading and believing in the protocols of the Elders of Zion than ever before because of the internet, and indeed believing worse in the blood libel, harvesting of organs, and so on. But the point at which really attacks and what the Israeli government does mutate into insidious attacks on the international Jewish conspiracy is a moment of genuine crisis. George Sorosophobia is absolutely standing in for the way the Rothschilds were described in the 19th century.
That then leads to the next question of, do you have any concerns for the physical survival of any of the Jewish communities in any Western countries in today's political climate?
For the physical survival, do you mean that they're going to be herded into concentration camps? No.
No, I don't think that.
If that's what physical survival mean, or whether there'll be mass migration out, no, I don't. No, I believe that the French community is very gay. There may well be. I suppose I'm asserting something because I don't want to believe it could possibly be the case that the Galut, the diaspora, would empty itself. A lot of the book that Robert kindly mentioned, the second volume too, Belonging, was about really the centuries-long fight to sort of make the possibility of having two identities which did not dilute each other. One's identity as a Jew, believing or not believing, and one's identity as a Frenchman or an Englishman or American. And that remains a high ideal, I think. And there was a moment when Bibi Netanyahu, in the wake of some particularly murderous terrorist attack, do you remember, Robert, came to Paris?
Yes.
And he met with upset and frightened and rather traumatized community. And I think the idea was to sing the Hatikva. Maybe the Hatikva was sung, but it was followed immediately, or maybe it was, do you remember, Suzanne? Maybe it was preceded by a tremendously moving singing of the Marseillaise. And I suppose, I'm someone who has lived in the Galut all my life, though I love Israel and devoted to it, and I don't love what the government does sometimes. So I would not want to see the diaspora be emptied, and it's not going to happen in my lifetime.
Thank you. We're going to take a little bit of a turn. You have such a wide variety of topics that you've written about, from people and culture to food and color. Is there one topic that you enjoy exploring more than others? And I'll combine that with another question. Are there any topics that you'd still like to explore that you haven't?
Goodness, that's biggie. I do like talking about art. I mean, Rob and I haven't talked about it very much, and I'm very lucky. At Columbia, I'm professor of art history as well as history, and I've done the art historical side. I'm constantly aware of two things. One, of the complicated richness of meaning. There is so much going on in a painting or in a sculpture. It's not just obviously an expression of a story or an expression of a particular attempt to grasp a portrait of a personality. There are issues of style, there are issues of choices, there are wonderful issues of which medium do you choose. So I'll give you one example that struck me. There's a beautiful book, and I recommend it to everybody if they don't know it, of Haggadot, edited by my wonderful colleague whose loss I still regret, Yosef Yerushalmi. And there were, of course, magnificently illuminated Haggadot in the Middle Ages, first of all borrowing the techniques of Christian illuminators, but then Jewish illuminators in their own right, from one end of Europe to the other, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi. But then when printing happens in the 15th century and early 16th century, the illustrations of the Haggadah suddenly become woodcuts. They become prints, especially in Prague and in some of the German cities. But Prague was a place where they were particularly glorious, and that added a kind of raw immediacy to those images of the plagues and of the four sons, which are really wonderful. So I do love, because I'm lucky to have had this moonlighting life in television. I do love the kind of world of words and world of images and the interface of all that, and I'm very lucky to do it. And the second point I was going to make after that very long answer is that the one thing pandemic has shown us is really how much people absolutely love being embedded in the arts, not just as consolation, but somehow it speaks to elemental things of importance, of fear and love and children and so on. And one thing I was very happy to do for the BBC was to do what they called Great Gallery Tours. This was on radio. I was talking about paintings in the Whitney and in the Prado. And if people wanted to access them, we showed them where to go online. But I was just actually using words really to put people in front of these pictures, and it had an enormous response from people who've been made happy by this tour to places which were then locked down completely.
I'm going to add one testimony to Simon's many talents, that it's not just exploring paintings or sculpture and seeing things in them. It's also exploring the hand, the penmanship of the poet when he sees a document, and there are things that he will show that are just remarkably insightful, and he has a brilliant eye.
Okay.
Thank you. Someone would like to know if you have ever studied Jewish life in Italy, now that we've just passed the 500th anniversary of the ghetto.
Well, there's a lot about Jewish life in Italy in Volume 2 of The Story of the Jews. What can I say? And one's family always needs the royalties. So head straight for your bookstore if open, or for Amazon. Yeah, I mean, Italy is a wonderful case again because printed Jewish literature really starts there, and because it is a kind of halfway place of many different Jewish cultures. It's very interesting, actually, when you go to the ghetto in Venice. The the oldest part of the ghetto, confusingly, in classical Venetian way, is what's called the new ghetto, because it was simply based on the same bit of land that was originally an arms foundry. It was called the New Foundry. And a bit further back is called the Old Ghetto. But the people who actually occupied the Old Ghetto were Johnny's come lately, or Abdul's come lately. They were people who came from after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal. So the Spanish-Portuguese Grand Synagogue is at that end of the ghetto, and the 5 little synagogues that cluster together in what looks like one building are mostly Ashkenazi foundations, because the first Jewish inhabitants of Venice, when they could be let in, were fleeing riotous mobs in southwest Germany, in Franconia, and places like Würzburg and Nuremberg and so on. So Italy is a kind of wonderfully complicated Jewish story, and very moving. The first synagogue music, for your questioner doesn't know the work of Salomone Rossi, who was simultaneously court musician to the extremely Christian Duke of Mantua, and the first person to do proper Baroque instrumental music for the synagogue. And they were performed in 1 or 2 of the synagogues in Mantua and Ferrara, as well as in Venice.
Well, I encourage everybody to go and get your book and read more about that. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the hour. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions. Though I do have to ask you one more thing. I think a lot of people don't know that you were once a food, critic, or you wrote about food?
Yes, I was the food writer for GQ magazine and Vogue. I did long essays for British Vogue until I presumed I wanted to write one about rabbits. And the editor said to me, this is a women's magazine, Simon, if you hadn't noticed, and our readers tend to prefer to wear rabbit than eat it. That was the end of that particular gig. But yes, I will be making leikach at the end of the week. I'll be making honey cake.
Wait, well, that was I was going to ask you. And with Rosh Hashanah coming, do you have a favorite dish for the holidays? That
I do like it. I've just given it to you. I think it's not like Pesach where tremendous rows. I mean, my family called themselves Sephardi trash because actually we came from Izmir. We went to Botoshani in Romania. There was a terrible fall from grace when we married into the Ashkenazim. So there was a terrible rows at Seder night between those who voted to cook charoset and those who said cooking is a shanda, you never do that. Rosh Hashanah is not the same. As long as you have, you're going to involve pomegranates in some way, it's a very good thing to do. I love using pomegranate salad. It was once thought in a midrashic tradition that the pomegranate had 613 seeds because corresponding to the Torah commandments. But as long as everybody has lots of sweetness, be it apples, honey, leikach, whatever, we hope for Shana Tova, and I wish everybody Shana Tova who've been watching us and listening to us.
And just one more lastly, do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to share with everybody?
Well, I hope I'm sort of a bit exhausted from all this romanticism, really, but there is a project in line, but those of us hacks on television who are at the very early stages of a new project know that one way to jinx it is by talking about it in advance. That most ominous of words, green lit, disappears like the green light at the end of Great Gatsby off the end of the jetty. And I want it still to be there, beckoning me on.
All right, well, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
So thank you both. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Simon, for this wonderful
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we ask that you go to Moment Magazine and make a donation so that we can continue doing great programming like this. And we hope that we see everybody next week for our session with Deborah Tannen and Norm Ornstein, and the following week, the musical tribute to Elie Wiesel. Again, thank you both, and have a Shana Tova. Bye-bye.
Shana Tova. Bye-bye.
Bye, Robert. Bye-bye, Susanna.
Bye-bye, Simon.
Bye-bye.